U.S. President Joe Biden warned on Thursday that there was a distinct possibility of a Russian invasion of Ukraine next month, as the Kremlin said, the U.S. rejection of its main demands to resolve the crisis left little ground for optimism. The U.S. and the Western alliance had firmly rejected any concessions on Moscow's main demands on Wednesday, refusing to permanently ban Ukraine from joining NATO, and saying allied deployments of troops and military equipment in Eastern Europe are non-negotiable. All eyes are now on President Vladimir Putin, who will decide how Russia will respond amid fears that Europe could again be plunged into war. Tensions are high on Ukraine's border with Russia. Here's what you need to know. The United States has ordered the families of all American staff at the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine to leave the country amid heightened concern that Russia, which has massed troops on the border, is about to invade. The United Kingdom withdrew some embassy staff in response to the growing threat from Russia. We are continuing to pursue the path of diplomacy, but if Russia chooses further escalation, then the security conditions, particularly along Ukraine's borders in Russia-occupied Crimea, in Russia-controlled eastern Ukraine, can deteriorate with little notice, a senior State Department official told reporters, according to a transcript of the call. Roughly 8,500 Americans' troops have been put on heightened alert in the U.S., in case NATO activates its response force, or if the security situation in Europe deteriorates further, the Pentagon has said. Ukraine has warned that Russia is trying to destabilize the country ahead of any planned military invasion. Western powers have repeatedly warned Russia against further aggressive moves against Ukraine. The Kremlin denies it is planning to attack, and argues that NATO support for Ukraine, including increased weapons supplies and military training, constitutes a growing threat on Russia's western flank. Speaking alongside his Ukrainian counterpart in Kiev on January 19, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said, Russia had ratcheted up its threats and amassed nearly 100,000 forces on Ukraine's border, which it could double on relatively short order. In late 2021, satellite photos revealed Russian hardware, including self-propelled guns, battle tanks, and infantry fighting vehicles, on the move, at a training ground roughly 300 kilometers from the border. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry's latest intelligence assessment says, Russia has now deployed more than 127,000 troops near Ukraine, including some 21,000 air and sea personnel, transferred more Iskander operational tactical missiles to the border, and increased its intelligence activity against the country. The assessment came after 3 rounds of diplomatic talks between Russia and the West aimed at de-escalating the crisis failed to produce a resolution. U.S. officials have said, a Russian invasion of Ukraine could happen at any point in the next month or two. Many of Russia's military bases are to the west of the vast country, the direction from which history suggests any threats are most likely to come. Russia's defense ministry has said, it is conducting regular winter military drills in its southern region, parts of which border Ukraine. Meanwhile, Ukraine's eastern Donetsk and Luhansk regions bordering Russia, an area known as Donbas, have been under the control of Russian-backed separatists since 2014. Russian forces are also present in the area, referred to by Ukraine as temporarily occupied territories, although Russia denies it. The front lines of the conflict have barely moved in 5 years, but there are frequent small-scale clashes and sniper attacks. Russia was angered when Ukrainian forces deployed a Turkish-made combat drone for the first time in October, to strike a position held by the pro-Russian separatists. Russia also has forces numbering in the tens of thousands at its massive naval base in Crimea, the Ukrainian territory it annexed in 2014. The Crimean Peninsula, which lies to the south of the rest of Ukraine, is now connected by a road bridge to mainland Russia. Russian tanks take part in a military drills at Molkino training ground in the Krasnodar region, on December 14, 2021. Tensions between Ukraine and Russia, both former Soviet states, escalated in late 2013, over a landmark political and trade deal with the European Union, after the pro-Russian then-president, Viktor Yanukovych, suspended the talks, reportedly under pressure from Moscow. Weeks of protests in Kiev erupted into violence. Then, in March 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, an autonomous peninsula in southern Ukraine, with strong Russian loyalties, on the pretext that it was defending its interests, and those of Russian-speaking citizens. First, thousands of Russian-speaking troops, dubbed Little Green Men, and later acknowledged by Moscow to be Russian soldiers, poured into the Crimean Peninsula. Within days, Russia completed its annexation in a referendum, that was slammed by Ukraine, and most of the world as illegitimate. Russian soldiers patrolled the area surrounding the Ukrainian military unit in Perevalny, outside Simferopol, Crimea, on March 20, 2014. Shortly afterwards, pro-Russian separatists in Ukraine's Donetsk and Luhansk regions declared their independence from Kiev, prompting months of heavy fighting, despite Kiev and Moscow signing a peace deal in Minsk in 2015, brokered by France and Germany. There have been repeated ceasefire violations. According to UN figures, there have been more than 3,000 conflict-related civilian deaths in eastern Ukraine since March 2014. The European Union and US have imposed a series of measures in response to Russia's actions in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, including economic sanctions targeting individuals, entities, and specific sectors of the Russian economy. The Kremlin accuses Ukraine of stirring up tensions in the country's east and of violating the Minsk ceasefire agreement. Would Putin get away with invading Ukraine again? Moscow sees the growing support for Ukraine from NATO, in terms of weaponry, training, and personnel, as a threat to its own security. It has also accused Ukraine of boosting its own troop numbers in preparation for an attempt to retake the Donbas region, an allegation Ukraine has denied. Russian President Vladimir Putin has called for specific legal agreements that would rule out any further NATO expansion eastwards towards Russia's borders, saying the West has not lived up to its previous verbal assurances. Putin has also said that NATO deploying sophisticated weapons in Ukraine, such as missile systems, would be crossing a red line for Russia, amid concern in Moscow that Ukraine is being increasingly armed by NATO powers. What is Ukraine's view? Ukraine's government insists that Moscow cannot prevent Kiev from building closer ties with NATO if it chooses. Russia cannot stop Ukraine from getting closer with NATO, and has no right to have any say in relevant discussions, the Foreign Ministry said, in a statement to CNN, in response to Russian calls for NATO to halt its eastward expansion. What does the United States say? President Joe Biden told Zelensky, earlier this month in a phone call, that the U.S. and its allies will respond decisively if Russia further invades Ukraine. Stay tuned for the latest news.